A cheating girl I married, she killed my father. And unfortunately, I died too. My spirit came back to take revenge. My name is Luca. I am 30 years old, and I own a small bicycle shop that sits on a quiet street. Life has a simple rhythm. Mornings of tools and tires, afternoons with customers, evenings spent closing up and heading home. At home, I live with my father. My mother died 12 years ago, and ever since my father has shared what little household work he can. He is not strong, but he keeps the house tidy, wakes early to make breakfast, and quietly carries on the routines that stitch our days together. I respect him for that. We have a modest understanding between us. I run the shop and earn. He keeps the house. When I return from work, he often has food waiting. Afterwards, I help in the kitchen, wash dishes, sweep floors. There is a rhythm and a comfort in the small chores. A silence of shared responsibility that can feel like love. I never felt alone. Even without my mother, my father's presence filled the house in ways words cannot fully explain. The shop is my trade and my refuge. I know how to tune brakes and true a wheel. Customers know me by name and by the way I handle a stubborn spoke. Business isn't lavish, but it sustains us. I rise before dawn, eat what my father prepares, and walk the short distance to the shop. The morning sun warms my shoulders. I open the shutters and begin the day. Our life seemed steadiant at the afternoon when I received a call that broke that steadiness. I was at the shop when news came. My father had fallen ill. Panic is small and sharp. I locked the shop without finishing the day's work and shoved my bike into the lane, hard fast. The city blurred past as I rode. In those minutes I felt how fragile routine truly is, how quickly it can crack. I reached home and found my father pale and sweating, a heaviness to his breath that I had not seen before. There was no time to hesitate. I carried him to the hospital with hands that trembled despite my resolve. The emergency room smelled of disinfectant and anxious voices. Doctors moved through their practiced motions. Nurses checked vitals and advised tests. They decided to keep him for observation. And for 2 days I sat in a plastic chair by his bed, watching the rise and fall of his chest. Hope was offered in measured sentences. Fear arrived in silent looks. After 2 days, he began to improve. Color returned to his face, and his complaints faded into jokes that tried to hide lingering weakness. The doctors discharged him with instructions and cautions, and we took the slow way home. Those 2 days changed, me reminding me that time with him was not infinite. Back at our house, the small rituals resumed. My father still made breakfast. I still left for the shop. But an unnamed urgency lived beneath every ordinary moment, as if each routine might be the last repeat of something precious. A few evenings after his recovery, my father called me to sit beside him. He looked older than before, his hair touched by more gray, his hands less steady. When we were together, he spoke simply, with a kind gravity. "Look, son," he said, "I have become old. I don't know when I might die." The words landed quietly, and yet there was a clarity to them that shifted something inside me. He continued, "If there is a girl you like, go ahead and get married." Perhaps this was his way of pushing me forward, of giving permission to live a life beyond the shop and household chores. I had never felt pressured to marry, but I had someone quietly in my heart, my cousin Maria. The thought of telling my father made my chest tight. His blessing, once given, would be everything. I promised him I would think seriously, and he seemed satisfied, as if a weight had been eased from his shoulders. That night, alone in my small room, I tried to imagine the future my father wished upon me. Maria lived in the same extended family circle, daughter of my father's older brother. I had carried a soft affection for her for some time, in casual visits, shared conversations, the way she smiled when she spoke of small things. I asked Maria to marry me. To my relief and quiet joy, she agreed. Her family's acceptance followed, and plans began to unfurl. Weddings are communal, demanding ceremonies, preparations, made by relatives and neighbors who stitch together food, clothing, and blessings. For my father and me, this felt like a new season. We both worked through the arrangements. Old grievances kept politely at bay as the families prepared garments and meals. There was joy in the activity, laughter over old stories, the gentle clinking of utensils, the bustle of fitting clothes, and dusting old heirlooms. In my father's eyes, I saw a happiness that softened the shadows of age. For a while, the past felt distant, the future, hopeful. Yet beneath the celebration lay a history not easily forgotten. Decades earlier, there had been a violent quarrel between my father and his brother over property. Emotions escalated, and the struggle ended with my father's brother falling from a roof and dying. The neighborhood assumed wrongdoing. Whispers circulated that my father had killed him. The police had investigated, and in time released my father. He never spoke much about the event. For 20 years the wound sat like a silent scar on our family's reputation. Maria's family, despite the marriage arrangements, still bore a subtle distrust born from that old tragedy. I knew of the suspicion but chose to believe in the innocence my father carried in his face and in his quiet life. Love, I told myself, would outrun old blame. On the day Maria and I were married, these histories were present like shadows at the edge of a bright room, rarely noticed but never wholly gone. Our wedding day was small, but filled with sincere joy. It took place in my uncle's home, my father's brother's house, where relatives gathered with food and songs. My father walked with a softness that seemed almost proud. Maria wore a shy smile. We married and returned home together, hand in hand, carrying the warmth of that day. Life resumed its rhythms. I went to the shop each morning. Maria stayed to help with the home, and my father moved through his routines. There were tender moments, Maria's hand in mine as we sat together, my father's quiet contentment as he watched, yet I couldn't entirely dismiss the old mistrust that hovered in the corners. Maria's family's belief that my father had been responsible for their loss was not erased by our marriage. Still, the house felt full. For the first time since my mother's death, I imagined a future with a steady partner and a father who would enjoy his son's happiness. Joy sat beside caution, a fragile balance I did not yet know how to hold. Days turned into weeks of ordinary life. I fixed bikes, greeted regulars, and balanced the ledgers, while Maria learned the small rituals of our home. My father continued his quiet care, food prepared, rooms kept neat, mornings filled with tea and clattering plates. The city moved on beyond our doorstep. Traffic, markets, the distant call of vendors. Within our walls we cultivated a fragile domestic peace. I sometimes caught Maria and my father in short conversations, her attempting to bridge family stories, him answering in his measured way. Their interactions were polite. They produced no warmth beyond the civility required of in. The history between their families was an unspoken seam, stitched but visible. I paid little attention. Love had a way of narrowing my sight to the one beside me. I believed, perhaps naively, that time would soften bitterness, and that the shared commitment of our marriage would overwrite the old hurts. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. I was at the shop when, later, I learned something terrible had happened at home. My father had been given tea and had suddenly fallen ill. When I burst through the door, the house smelled of antiseptic and panic. Neighbors gathered with anxious faces. I found my father collapsing, eyes glazing, breath failing. We called for help, but his motion slowed, like the lowering of a curtain. In moments that would stretch into a lifetime, he was gone. The world narrowed into a single point of loss. My grief was raw, immediate, and bewildering. At the funeral, people murmured condolences that felt like noise around a hollow space in my chest. I could not imagine waking to his breakfast or seeing him quietly move through the rooms. The house felt too empty, the silence too loud. I told myself old age had taken him, that perhaps his heart had simply stopped. I did not at first suspect anything else. A month crawled by in a haze of mourning. Documents had to be arranged, relatives consoled, and the rituals of passing observed. The post-mortem report, something administrative that I expected would simply confirm what my heart already felt, arrived one afternoon while I was at the shop. I unfolded it with the same slow hands that handled tools and tires. The conclusion on the page made my eyes burn. Poisoning. The words were clinical, but their meaning struck like a thunderclap. My first thought went to Maria. No, I couldn't imagine it. But suspicion is a patient thing that waits to be noticed. Many pieces of the household routine slotted into place with a new and chilling clarity. Questions that had not existed before multiplied. Had someone wanted revenge for an old wound? Had my marriage, shallow in its early days, been sown with malice? Each answer felt worse than the last. My heart pounded with a furious disbelief that quickly curdled into a dangerous hot confusion. Anger and shock drove me as I left the shop in a whirl. I mounted my bicycle and raced through the streets with a single thought. Confront Maria. Demand an explanation. The city blurred into a smear of sound and color. I remembered every small detail of our life together. The way she poured tea. The way she adjusted a curtain, and a new poisonous doubt poisoned memory. I did not stop for traffic lights. I was a man propelled by a chaos he couldn't yet name. As I crossed a busy road, the world tightened to a cruel instant. A truck, fat and immense, loomed where my attention faltered. The impact was sudden and final. I felt no pain at first, only a stunned awareness, then a cold farther out than any fear. I was dying. My body was carried home. Neighbors murmured, and my chest slackened. But my spirit did not release. Some ember of me remained, and it burned with one consuming heat: revenge. Death changed the rules of my existence, but did not extinguish my will. While my body lay still and people whispered prayers, my spirit hung close to the rooms I had known. I watched from a vantage point no one would see. The world continued to move around my silent form preparations. Condolences, the mechanical motions of life. Maria wept in ways that shook me. She tore at her hair, falling into my father's empty chair, and mourning with a theatrical grief that pulled at the edges of my suspicion. People comforted her. They offered platitudes I had heard before. The house settled into the new normal of widowhood and orphaned remembrances. Nights came and passed. All the while, an ember of fury smoldered within me. I could not be consoled. The thought that the woman I had loved, my wife May, had planned my father's death pressed around my ribs like a hand. From that ache rose a sharp hunger for justice, or perhaps for something colder: vengeance. The week after the funeral grew heavy with ritual and pretense. Maria's performance of grief might have fooled many. I was a watcher who saw beyond the mask. From the corner where I observed, I noticed the small choices she made: how she kept the teacups in a certain cupboard, how she avoided certain rooms during the day. I catalogued the moments, trying to find patterns that could prove what I already suspected. It is a strange thing to love someone and then to stitch together reasons to condemn them. But grief is an architect. It builds structures of certainty from scraps of evidence. I heard conversations behind closed doors, snippets of talk that felt like rehearsed lines. The neighbors took sides. Some whispered support for her. Others cast furtive glances at the past. In those nights, as the house slept, I planned. Revenge is a landscape that widens until one can see its every path. I decided that if she had taken what was mine, my father, then the balance must be restored. The night I chose to act was moonless and still, the kind of darkness that presses close and makes small sounds enormous. Maria lay asleep, and the house breathed in the quiet. My spirit moved in a way my body could no longer do. I was weightless and deliberate. I lingered by her bed and watched the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Her face, in the pale slant of moonlight through the curtains, looked smaller than I had remembered. She murmured in sleep and turned. Her hair fell across the pillow like a dark flag. I felt the heat of the past, the stolen tea, my father's sudden collapse. On that heat flared into a cold, precise plan. There was a fan above her bed, an ordinary ceiling fan spinning its slow, domestic revolution. It had been above us both on countless nights, a quiet companion to our small household. That ordinary object became the instrument of my decision. I moved the fan with attention, not blind fury. There was a cruelty to what I intended that felt like completion rather than rage. I signaled it as if the blade were a willing thing. Time, always obedient in death, slowed so that each moment felt like a careful stroke of fate. Maria woke, startled, words mingling with a fevered denial. "This is a dream," she whispered. But the fan blades, once guided, found their target. The room filled with a mechanical whir that had once been humdrum and comforting. It became a thunderous instrument. The blade struck, and in an instant the life I had watched and mourned was taken from her. Her cry cut the air, raw and unbelieving. For me, standing outside the skin of my old body, the sensation of completion swept through like a release. The house exhaled as if some long-held breath had finally been let go. After that night, the household entered an eerie stillness. People spoke in hushed tones and wondered how 2 deaths had occurred within such a short span. The neighborhood buzzed with theories, and rumors, old wounds resurfacing. Questions about inheritance and motives. The police came and made careful inquiries. For a living man, this would have been a labyrinth of suspicion and accusation. For me, as a spirit, it was an observation of consequence. I watched investigators take statements, heard provisional theories: malice, accident, retribution float in the air. Friends and relatives gathered, making brittle condolences that failed to reach the hollow places. The house that once echoed with small domestic noises now felt like a stage where actors performed a play, whose script had turned black. In the days that followed, the outward routines of investigation and burial carried on, but nothing inside the walls could return to ordinary. To funerals, to endings left the house, a relic of what had been. In the quiet that followed, I found no solace. Revenge had been completed, and yet it did not bring the warmth I had imagined. Instead, it left a deeper hollowness, a dryness where feeling used to be. To take a life, even when convinced of the righteousness of the act, does not stitch the past back together. It unravels new threads of guilt and emptiness. I wandered through memories the way my father had smiled as he prepared breakfast. Maria's hand that had once sought mine and found them all altered by the sharpness of violence. Those memories no longer felt like anchors. They were fragments that pricked like glass when I let them touch me. Around the neighborhood, people whispered of curse or fate. Some thought the past had finally answered itself. But for me it was complicated. The warmth of paternal comfort was gone, and the satisfaction of vengeance was a hollow echo. There are consequences that reach beyond bodies, into the lives of the living, in ways a ghost cannot fully understand. The legal inquiries shifted from suspicion to fuller investigation. Officers examined relationships, histories, and evidence. The story of the rooftop fight that had haunted our family for 20 years resurfaced in records and testimony. Old neighbors were asked to remember events where memory had already softened the edge of pain. People pointed fingers in muted gatherings, wanting explanations for what had happened. Life, for those still breathing, had to continue. The shop closed, accounts settled, and the house prepared for the absent bodies. I hovered in the rooms where once I had lived, feeling the absence as a physical draft. Sometimes I tried to reach through the quiet to touch regrets, confess, or apologize. The air remained still. The living carried on. Some tried to rebuild, some tried to forget. The neighborhood learned that a household could be hollowed out by secrets and by acts that settle like dust on every surface. There are stories that end with a single terrible act, and others that continue to ripple outward long after the last footstep fades. Ours was the latter. The old quarrel, the property fight, and the roof had created a scar that never healed. The deaths reopened it, and people looked for justice in many places. For me, in the peculiar afterlife I occupied, there was a strange education in watching consequences unfold. I saw how blame can be passed like a coin, how grief can be both sincere and performative, how ordinary tools, a teacup, a fan, can become instruments of fate in the hands of human will. Sometimes I wished for redemption, a chance to apologize to my father, to tell him I had loved him and had failed to keep him safe. But time did not grant that wish. Instead, I learned that endings are rarely neat. They spread like ink, staining everything they touch. In the end, our house remained a shell that contained stories and unspoken histories. My bicycle shop eventually closed, without me to run its shutters down, echoing the shape of the life I once tended. The neighborhood moved through new cycles of births and losses, oblivious to the sharp outlines of our past for long stretches. People sometimes spoke of us as a tragic family. A father lost, a son killed by chance, a wife accused, revenge enacted. Others told differing versions, each fitting their own fears and expectations. For me, existence had narrowed to a memory that could neither mend nor fully explain what was done. The fire of revenge had consumed one final thing, Murray, and, in doing so, consumed me, too. There was no triumphant peace afterward. Only the continuing ache of what had been lost, and the knowledge that some actions once taken cannot be undone. The house kept its silence, and the city moved forward, carrying our small, terrible story in its wake.